Welcome back to The World This Week. A new outbreak of sectarian violence has left several dead in Egypt. Most of the dead are Christians. President Morsi has condemned the killings, but critics say that the government is doing little to protect the rights of the country's Coptic Christian minority. The revolution that overthrew dictator Hosni Mubarak saw an unprecedented level of solidarity between the two communities. But there are now fears that discrimination against Christians, often a bellwether for the larger issue of civil rights as a whole, is being used by the embattled new regime to bolster its position. Here's more.
After a week of violence, the message of this protest in Cairo was clear. Egypt's Christians and Muslims must stay united. The demonstrators marched to the capital's Coptic cathedral, where, according to eyewitnesses, mourners were attacked on Sunday during the funeral of 4 Christians killed in clashes earlier in the week. Riot police fired tear gas into the cathedral and allegedly stood by as unknown men attacked the funeral goers who had been chanting anti-government slogans. Reports say 2 were killed and around 90 injured in the clashes. The funeral was for the 4 Christian men killed in Khusus near Cairo on Saturday, after a gunfight which allegedly broke out after a Muslim centre was daubed with offensive graffiti. A Muslim man was also killed.
في أكيد ناس ليها يد في الموضوع. أكيد يعني ناس ليها إن هي تعمل فتنة بين المسيحيين. إحنا طول عمرنا عايشين في المنطقة، أنا بقالي أكتر من 30 سنة في المنطقة دي. عمري ما شفت أي عنف ولا تطرف ولا أي حاجة في المنطقة بتاعتنا.
The tensions are a shock in a country where Christians and Muslims have historically lived in harmony. But attacks on Egypt's Coptic Christians, who make up 10% of the population, have increased since the revolution that ousted former President Mubarak. President Morsi has promised full rights to Christians and said this week that any attack against Cairo's cathedral was an attack against him. But many Christians here feel they are being marginalised by a Muslim Brotherhood-led government that allows Islamists a greater role in political life in Egypt than ever before. In his strongest criticism of the president yet, the head of the Coptic Church in Egypt, Pope Tawadros II, accused Morsi of failing to protect Christians following the funeral attack. As they continue to mourn their loved ones, Egyptians from both faiths will be hoping that this week's violence does not mark a new era for relations between Christians and Muslims here. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, with me in the studio are Carl Soderbergh, Director of Policy and Communications for the Minority Rights Group International, and Ayman Abouzaid, a political commentator who works in a multi-faith organisation in London. Welcome to the programme, both of you. So, Carl, do you think that the situation in Egypt has deteriorated since the overthrow of Mubarak for the Copts?
Yes, unfortunately, we've seen an increasing number of incidents of violence between Coptic Christians and the Muslim majority. And the sad thing is that a pattern has been established where the police and the security forces are often very late in arriving and quite ineffectual in trying to re-establish law and order. And then very little is done as follow-up in terms of investigation and prosecution. So, for instance, in the period since President Mohamed Morsi came to power, there have been at least 5 incidents of sectarian violence, and we know of only 1 instance that has actually been followed up at all. And even in that case, the people who were detained were released without charge.
And why do you think this is? Why do you think the security forces have been so lax in dealing with these issues?
I think probably some of this, at least, is a legacy of the Hosni Mubarak period, because essentially we're talking about the overthrow of an authoritarian regime where the police and the security forces were allowed quite free rein. And so there have also been instances of violence, police violence against Muslim majority members as well that haven't been followed up. So I think there's quite some work that needs to be done to establish proper routines in the police and security forces. What's urgent now, of course, is to convince the Coptic Christian community that the government takes their situation seriously.
Ayman, President Morsi has condemned these attacks. Do you think that the problem that Carl is referring to is because he really doesn't have a grip on the state machine? He doesn't really have a grip on what the military and the police are doing?
No, I think the nature of the period that we're in now, after such a revolution, and the deep-rooted issues, and grabbing tight onto the political, the security forces and agencies, and utilizing them for the regime, etc., etc. That sort of context is very messy, and it takes time to organize, especially in a kind of environment where there are parts of the security forces and individuals in the security forces who have been accustomed to so much luxury in the past to serve the regime. Many of them say, I don't believe in Morsi as being my leader, because they don't want him to be the leader. They want the old regime and the benefits that came with it. Some of them say, I will discipline the people of Egypt because of what they did. They turned against the security forces and the way Egypt was previously. I'm going to teach them a lesson, and if I see issues on the ground, if I see security matters, I will detach myself from it and let them know how big I am and how how much weight they should give me. And that sort of environment, not only do you have to be careful, but it's very, very sensitive. And we've had an instance in Georgia, for example, after the revolution there. One of the solutions there was to withdraw the security forces and send down 20,000 people to organize the streets, etc. But that's not what we want, and that's not what Dr. Morsi wants. He is very, very particular about establishing a nation where each of its departments, each of its agencies and sections are taking responsibility of their duties with love, with care, and with sincerity. And we've seen this over the last 2 years, no doubt. Now, in terms of the Christians, I have a personal belief from what I'm observing from Morsi's practices. He wants to bring the Christians into mainstream. He's not the one that detached them. The people of Egypt are not the ones that detached them. These doors, these neighbors had doors open opposite each other and children running in and out of these houses. They were eating on one plate. Many, many people don't even know if the person next to him is a Muslim or not. That sort of social harmony and social environment, which, as the document says, was always there, it's something that I shouldn't have to make worse now by me now coming into a just society, which I'm aiming for. Whether it's happened or not at this moment in time is another story. But I'm trying to establish a just society where there's equality. Now, for me to start to come back after what we've lived 30 years of the previous regime and say, I'm now going to deal with this as two separate issues, the Muslim and the Christians, let's see what rights these wants and what rights that wants, you're indirectly causing a lot more divide. My understanding, my perception is that Dr. Morsi is trying to bring them into the mainstream because they have rights as well. They have rights they were not given in the previous regime.
There's a historic problem, isn't there, here? The Egyptian regimes, the Mubarak regime, used this divide.
Absolutely.
And we all know that immediately preceding the revolution, there was the massive attack on the Christian, on a Christian church. Many, many Muslims responded with huge solidarity. But there is a deep-seated question in the Egyptian state. And my question really is Morsi dealing with this? And you seem to be saying, no, these guys are running around saying, I'm going to take it out on the Egyptian population. Now, all right, Morsi may not want to upset the apple cart, but if he doesn't deal with it, this apple cart's going to get upset anyway.
I think that the main issue, I mean, like I said, the social context, there was no issue. There is that harmony, there is that love, there is that sincerity amongst the people of Egypt generally, regardless. On the political arena, it just needs to be organized where they're starting to feel, as part of its policies of treating them as mainstream as they should be treated, they will actually feel that they're part of the country. But what I'm trying to say is to treat it as two separate issues, you're causing a lot more friction there by saying that you are different to what the mainstream population of the country, they're part of us and we're part of them. Now let's put aside all these extreme issues and comments, even from the Christian side. The priests, the senior priests that come up and say that the Muslim majority are just visitors in the country and we are the people. Let's put all this aside. These are all leftovers from the previous regime. But do we treat them as something separate, or do we treat them as the whole nation and give them the rights that the regime previously weren't giving them, as well as others? There were other Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., who weren't given their rights as well. Do we now start separating and saying everyone needs to be treated in different ways? Or do we translate the social harmony into political, economical harmony and everyone treated the same?
On this. Do you think that, as I've said, there's a specific history with the way in which the regimes have behaved towards Christians in Egypt? People would say in the same way that sometimes British governments have been accused of institutional racism towards Muslims and black people in this country. It's that kind of divide in society. But do you think that this issue is now connected with the wider issue of how challenges to the regime as a whole are being dealt with by the authorities? Because some of the police behaviour that you referred to is certainly not unique to attacks on cops. The recent strike by rail workers was something of the same thing. There have been repeated demonstrations that have been treated in the same way since Mubarak fell.
Yes, and I was thinking specifically of the violence in Port Said earlier this year, which was a very clear case of police brutality, and there the victims belonged to the Muslim majority. So clearly there is a very profound problem in terms of police accountability.
And the reaction in Port Said was so powerful that the police actually had to withdraw at a certain point, didn't they?
Yes, yeah. So I think, yes, absolutely. This has to do with the legacy after Hosni Mubarak. It has to do with putting in place a civilian government with proper controls over the security forces, over the military. At the same time, I beg to differ just slightly in what you described, because there are other forms of institutional discrimination that have to be addressed. In particular, for example, the Christian communities face very great problems when it comes to seeking building permits for their places of worship. And I don't think that any permits were granted in 2012, for example. And those are restrictions in place for them, but not for Muslim majority communities. And I think that that is both unfortunate from a rights-based perspective, but also in terms of the signal the government is sending that in essence, that there is a discrimination going on, and discrimination can be okay in a way if they don't take steps to address such discriminatory structures in the government and the legislation.
I mean, Ayman, the question of the building permits, that was an issue under Mubarak.
Absolutely.
It should be dealt with by now, surely.
I
mean, it would be the strong, a strong signal for the Morsi government to say, that's the past, we're finished with that.
Yeah, I trust it will be dealt with, because that's something that many people in Egypt have been calling for equality in. Even the Muslim Brotherhood themselves, they've mentioned this. And then obviously there were lots of discussions, you know, how do we do it? Do we do it based on population in each area and then build 1-2 churches based on the Christian population, etc., etc.? But we mustn't forget as well that nothing has changed from the, you know, the Islamist side, if you like, where the lack of freedom that was given for them to you know, maneuver and build and do what their activities as well. But the point here I'm trying to say isn't necessarily that we're not saying it shouldn't happen. It will happen, and I'm sure it will happen. It's in the mind of Dr. Morsi and his team. But two things here. One is the very, very particular priorities of the people. In terms of the stability, in terms of the security, in terms of many, many things that are an absolute priority and very urgent at the moment. Now, if I can keep myself patient and other people can keep themselves patient by just saying, let's go back and see what these people's mentality is towards that matter. And that gives me very clear indication that they're very sincere about wanting to make that change and give people their rights. And by the way, this isn't something that Dr. Morsi and his team are giving a favor to the Christians or doing them, you know, doing them a favor as such. This is something in the core of the Islamic teachings. You know, giving people their rights to worship and giving people their rights to worship in, you know, comfortably, you know, decent, you know, space, etc., etc. So even if he wanted to, his love towards his religion and practicing towards his religion won't allow him to. But I think it's just a case of priority. And there are things that need to be brought to the table, opened up, reshuffled, organized, etc. Because the issues that are in Egypt are very, very deep-rooted. And when we talk about deals with businesses for 40 years and 25 years, a cleaning company, for example, you have the previous regime have a contract for tens of years, and that's not helping you maneuver, but at the same time, the people are wanting the streets to be cleaned, etc. there are a lot of, hands being tied. So, like I said, I think it's in the mind. I think it's it is no doubt a priority. But is it a greater priority now? Is it, is it causing them not to be able to pray? And let's not forget that if you brought all the Christians in Egypt and put them into churches at this moment in time, they will be able to move quite comfortably. Whereas we see, on TV, on satellite channel, that many Muslims that are praying anywhere in Egypt on a Friday, there's a 20% of them on the streets. So, in terms of space, in terms of ability to go into their churches and pray, it's not the immediate priority now. I'm sure the Coptics and the Christians themselves want, other things, as well as that, and it's probably a more priority where, the economic system, etc., which is something that I'd like to see attended to as a top priority.
Carl, this story is now going to intersect, I think, with another story about the question of the security forces, because the report that President Morsi commissioned into the military's behaviour during the 18 days is now finished. Very substantial parts of it are now being leaked in the press, both in Egypt and in The Guardian in this country. What they appear to show is that this went right to the top of the army high command, the tortures that, I think anybody who was there or watched it closely knew that this was happening during the 18 days, knew about the stories, knew people that were tortured in the Egyptian Museum and so forth. But this is now a trail which is leading right to the top. Morsi is saying, I haven't read the report yet, but when he does, he's got a big decision to make, hasn't he? How do you think that this will intersect with this question? Because you were referring to the slowness of the security forces in responding.
I think President Morsi is faced with a very difficult situation. He essentially has to reassert civilian control over the military. And I think that because there's been such a tradition of military influence in political affairs in Egypt, this is not easy. We saw, for example, that the government had to do a last-minute back-down during the constitutional negotiations and give the military discretion to continue trying civilians before military courts, something that had been rejected in earlier drafts of the constitution, but then was given way in the final draft. So I think essentially what President Morsi needs to do is send both a very clear signal that to end the climate of impunity that has been developing, and then to implement at all levels of the security hierarchy and follow up and bring charges and put on trial people who have committed grave human rights violations, because otherwise this climate of impunity will continue, and it sends a message both within the security apparatus but the wider population as well, that one isn't necessarily answerable for the actions one takes.
Ayman, another thing which the Constitution did, which many of the critics say it shouldn't have done, is give the military sole right to try their own. Do you think now that with this report, it's a weapon in President Morsi's hands if he wants to use it to deal with the deep security state, the remnants of the Mubarak state? Do you think he'll use it, or do you think he won't?
I think what we've seen over the last period is that he's been quite wise in choosing the right time in a situation that he can grasp onto and then use that opportunity to make change. We've seen, for example, when he made changes to Marshal Tantawi, for example, and the head of Chief of Staff, that opportunity was grasped. And I think it's very particular that he's very careful, in which he is very careful about choosing time and choosing the situation and when he can take those steps, because the situation in Egypt is very, very sensitive, and especially when you've got a large population of people who haven't had this openness in politics and being able to speak their minds out, etc. Even they and their lack of deep interaction in the political arena, if you like, in the last 30 years, you need to give some space and give time and to educate people about what you're doing as well. Sometimes you're taking a step to make change, positive change, but people perceive it as a negative. So that's why the political arena in Egypt is very, very sensitive. So I think it will happen. The changes will happen. He does have a percentage of people in, you know, all over the country that want that change, but it's a process, and that's what people need to realize. It's a process, and it's a case of looking for unrisky opportunities to go in and make that change, because you don't want the backlash to be big.
Carl, do you think, Ayman's making the case that there can be dangers to going too fast, but in a revolution there are dangers to moving too slowly. Now, in recent weeks, Port Said was in a virtual state of insurrection. In many ways, it was more strongly in favour of the revolution in the 18 days, even than Cairo. That's kicked off. Mahala, one of the iconic names, the textile mill, that's kicked off in recent days. The train drivers have had a very effective strike. Do you think time's running out for Morsi?
Well, I think, especially with regard to the Coptic Christian community, the time is running out. I do absolutely appreciate what you say, that it's a very tricky situation. President Morsi has an awful lot on his plate. He has only been in office hardly, if not even a year. But the problem is that ever since he came to power, the Coptic Christian community has been pleading for protection, for follow-up, pursuing cases of violence against them. And people have been warning from the broader human rights community that if the government doesn't take action, and if it allows this climate of impunity to spread, the violence against the Copts will get worse. This fact now that we have seen violence in the cathedral compound itself, and where security forces allegedly tossed tear gas canisters into the cathedral. Well, how much worse does it need to get before the government takes action? It will be the question that many Copts will be then putting during this week and the days to come.
Briefly, because we're coming to the end of the programme, is Morsi running out of time?
I don't think he's running out of time, but I think with the incident, the last incident and other incidents that have happened, I think just to look deeper into the context of how things arise and how things developed, and taken into consideration as well, you know, shotguns coming out of the cathedral itself, and if obviously the debate of, you know, was it the police first or was it the people, the Christians inside that started? That's a separate debate. But the question is, what are weapons doing inside in the very first place, and what's it doing diverted towards the police? If we're talking about law and order, but I don't think he's running out of time. I believe people are starting to realize that it's a process. It's a process that people have to be patient about. And people like this great leader, Erdogan in Turkey himself, said that what Morsi has done, what he has done in 10 years in the military, Morsi has done in a very much more shorter time. Okay, well, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to bring the discussion to a close, but I'm sure we'll be revisiting the question of the progress of the Egyptian revolution in future programmes. So do rejoin us next week.